Book 20 of 2020 was Shatter Me by Tahereh Mafi. So this book is a dystopia, and Juliette is the main character, and she is incarcerated, and you don't really know why when you first start reading it. And I appreciated Mafi's kind of like playing around with style, because at the beginning she kind of says that the character Juliette repeats a lot, so there's a lot of repetition in it, and there's a lot of kind of like strikeouts where Juliette's wrote something and then she's crossed it out, because it's almost like it's a first person and she's almost like wrote it down, if you will. And this is good because it aids characterisation and, you know, presents her as someone who's kind of like unsure of herself, which is, you know, it's okay. I think if I hadn't have seen that at the beginning, I would have been a bit annoyed by it, but I appreciate that she was kind of like trying to, you know, do something different. Unfortunately, this book is quite similar to a lot of other books in the YA dystopia genre. It's very tropey. So, for example, Juliette is presented as quite a passive character, someone who, you know, doesn't really stand up for herself, doesn't, you know, she has a quite lack of identity, and she meets this guy who comes into her cell. In fact, I'm not going to kind of go into spoilers, but there's this guy who is attractive and is kind of objectified in the prose because she comments on kind of his physical body in terms of it being like attractive, or what's supposed to be attractive. And they fall, you know, in love with each other quite immediately. Now, unfortunately, this is something that's in a lot of YA literature, and I wonder if this is because I'm too old now to appreciate this, but you don't fall in love like that. Like, that's not what happens. And so to kind of it just be like a media, it's kind of like a you know, a teenage kind of infatuation, but it's presented as kind of love, and it's really infuriating as well because it's very anti-feminist in the sense that Juliette is waiting for her saviour, and you know, if you think about like the psychology behind wanting to be rescued, it's all to do with kind of like death anxiety, and you know, you used to be protected by your parents, and then as you grow up, because your parents aren't there to do it for you anymore, you need somebody else to replace them and then them to be your rescuer. And unfortunately, it is that women want the rescuer from the male, but obviously the male never gets that kind of rescuing, and if you are a feminist female, you never get that rescuing either. And so it is something that's prominent within our psychology, and I understand that it could be like metaphorical of our psyche. And actually it could be, you know, if you think of like Jungian archetypes and Jungian kind of interpretations of like fairy tales, like for example, The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid is, you know, she wants to be individuated and away from her father, you know, she's under the sea. She sees Eric as her saviour on land. She gives up her whole identity to be rescued by Eric. She then kind of is rescued and everything, but actually it's symbolic of one personality, and the anima and the animus, which is the male and the female part of the personality, becoming unified so that you become an entire person. So I understand that the kind of deep psychology of it isn't kind of misogynistic, but on the surface it does come across as being really anti-feminist, and so I have an issue with that, particularly when young women, because this is also the trope, it's always a protagonist is a young woman. They're kind of getting the idea that young women need to be saved by a male and need to be saved by a relationship. You're never saved by a relationship. You've got to save yourself. You know, you've got to come to kind of what's the word? Come to the realization of who you are yourself. You can't do that in, you know, in a relationship. So it worries me that there's a lot of young girls that are going to be reading these books thinking that that is the norm when it's not. You know, that, you know, we want that saviour to stop our death anxiety, but you actually need to be, you know, you need to deal with that death anxiety basically. So that was kind of annoying to read, and actually there's not really that much that's happening in the book because that's kind of like the focal point of it. There is a little bit of an extra element to it in the sense that Juliette has powers that she doesn't know about that she'll come into you know, towards the end of the book, but this book doesn't really touch on that really. It's only kind of at the end. So she's obviously going to gain her strength in the later books, because this is obviously part of a longer series. And there's a little bit of a kind of hinting at the dystopic world and a little bit of power struggles, but the power struggle is with, it's not even with the kind of overall, it's with the son of somebody who's kind of in power. So it's not really like the, you know, if you think about something like the Hunger Games did have the trope of, you know, a male and a female kind of falling in love with each other, but that was better because, you know, Katniss, is that what she's called, Katniss? She, you know, likes Gale initially, and then she ends up falling in love with Peter, but it's kind of not straight away, and she does it initially for the benefit of them in the Hunger Games, and then obviously falls in love with him after, which is actually how you kind of fall in love. That was more reminiscent of reality. And the difference with that is that that's not the focal point of the book. The focal point of the book is the dystopic world and the power structures between the capital and the other kind of districts, and that kind of overturning between District 13 and the capital. So the focal point of that is not the romance, which in this it is, which is why it's so bad. And, you know, I mean, even Divergent, which is more focal on that kind of, you know, relationship between the main character, I can't remember her name now, but with Four, it's still not the focal point, because she's part of, you know, her kind of part within society, and there's like the erudites, and then there's that kind of whole power structure between those and the other kind of factions. So the kind of new YA literature that's coming out, that's almost kind of like a copy of Hunger Games and of Divergent, they're kind of coming away from what dystopia is all about, which is the power structures and the kind of, you know, almost kind of a discussion between capitalism and socialism, which is, you know, why I think those are more attractive to adults, and taking those bits away and just making it kind of like a romance, which is like, you know, a bit like Twilight. And I get why they're kind of doing it, but if you like dystopia like I do, I'm not interested in the romance part of it. That's not what's brought me to dystopia. If I wanted that, I would go and read a romance book. So I was kind of a little bit kind of disappointed by it, because it was a really good kind of plot and a really good idea, but it's just fallen down in its delivery because it's just focused on this kind of romantic part of it, which is a bit saccharine, really, to be honest. It's just, you know, the stuff of teenage dreams. So unfortunately, because that was so prominent and unrealistic, it meant that I didn't really like it as much as what I probably would have done. I still gave it a 3 stars. I still said that I liked it because I did want to read it, and I still wanted to kind of carry on and find out what was happening. But it lacked that kind of dystopic element of it which I was looking for. So I probably wouldn't recommend it to read.